Welcome to Inside Medical Malpractice. This subject fascinates everyone everywhere because it affects everyone everywhere. My name is Chris Rokosh. I'm a registered nurse, legal consultant and educator, and the president of Connect Medical Legal Experts. Medical malpractice affects patients, families, nurses, doctors, midwives, healthcare institutions, the associations that define medical standards, lawyers, and the general public. Each month, we'll be looking at malpractice issues from different perspectives, featuring honest, candid, insightful interviews by people and professionals with a wealth of information to share. Thanks for spending time with me today. Now let's dive into this fascinating subject. Today, on Inside Medical Malpractice, I'm talking to Maia Tomljanovic, and we're going to talk about a very unique and interesting perspective on the intersection between healthcare and law. That perspective is that of a young medical malpractice lawyer entering the hospital to have a baby, and things did not go quite as planned. I think it's fair to say that it's likely, and almost certain even, that at some point in our lives, we will all enter the healthcare system with the expectation of healing and recovery and coming out in better shape than we went in. But what is that experience like for someone whose career has focused on finding negligence in the healthcare system? How do you trust that all will go well when you've seen more bad outcomes than good? Let's find that out today. Welcome, Maia.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Before we go any further, because we have lots of interesting stuff to talk about, I'd like to share a little bit about your awesomeness before we get started. Maia received her Juris Doctor degree from the University of Saskatchewan in 2012. And for those of you who don't know what a Juris Doctor is, because I didn't until a few years ago, a Juris Doctor or a JD is a common law degree. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's essentially the same as an LLB. They just changed the name for some reason.
They just changed the name.
I can't explain it.
I always thought it was a crossover of, like, you were a doctor and a lawyer.
We all got a kick out of the doctor thing, but unfortunately, no.
Following graduation, Maia joined the firm of Cumming and Gillespie here in Calgary as an associate lawyer, and she remains there today. Her practice focuses on medical malpractice, personal injury, and professional negligence, and she acts exclusively for injured parties and their families. I happen to know that Maia is an extremely approachable lawyer to her clients. She's passionate about her work, and she takes very seriously the responsibility of acting for the individuals that she represents. She also volunteers for the Legal Education Society of Alberta, coaching new students, sitting on the executive of the Canadian Bar Association Health Law South Section, and she's been on the board of the Alberta Civil Trial Lawyers Association. She also guest lectures for the University of Calgary Faculty of Law, and like all lawyers at Cumming and Gillespie, has a belief in pro bono work. So once again, Maia, welcome, and thank you for being here. On top of what I've just said, is there anything else you'd like us to know about you before we get started?
I feel like I'm not that interesting, but, I would say that...
Don't believe that because she is. I happen to know she is.
Medical malpractice has become quite a passion of mine. It's not really anything that I thought I was going to get into when I was in law school. I thought I was going to be a criminal prosecutor, and just things work out a certain way and work out the way they should. And I'm very fortunate and happy to be in the position I'm in today.
So why medical malpractice? What was that journey that landed you there?
Honestly, the beginning of my law career, felt like a bit of dumb luck that I ended up where I was. I met Craig Gillespie and got hired at Cumming and Gillespie, not really knowing much about them or their firm or the work they did. It was a bit happenstance, and
a lot of good stories start like that.
This is true. We spent part of my interview talking about going to Value Village and finding ridiculous outfits. So that's kind of the start of things. But so working there, I started with personal injury and motor vehicle accidents, primarily slip and falls, those kinds of claims. And a big bulk of my practice still revolves around those types of claims. But working with Craig Gillespie in particular, he does medical malpractice work. And I was fortunate that pretty much from the get-go, I got to be involved in quite a few of his files. and particularly the birth injury claims I became quite involved in and got to go through many of those files through to settlement or approaching trial, and I learned a lot, and the more I did them, the more I want to be involved in those cases.
So you thought you'd have a baby.
Needed to know everything there is to know beforehand.
Exactly.
That's also why I suck up to Chris a lot.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, my background is a lot of labor and delivery, many, many years of nursing. And how are you finding? Because, I mean, from my perspective, I'm an outsider looking in. Law is tough, and medical malpractice law is the toughest of the tough. How do you find working in that tough area of law?
It's hard.
Yeah.
I kind of have mixed feelings about law because I feel like people often seem very impressed just by the fact that you got a law degree, and I don't think that should be the case. Not that it's not difficult, but a lot of people can get through law school. It doesn't make you anything that special. But the thing about medical malpractice, especially for somebody who didn't even take biology in grade 11 or 12.
So the JD definitely isn't doctor. Is that what we're talking about?
Definitely would not succeed trying to become a doctor. But there is just such a huge learning curve. Like, I remember actually, I've talked to you about this before, I believe, but my first kind of delving into the medical malpractice world was going to a medical malpractice legal conference with a bunch of lawyers from across Western Canada who practice in the area. And Craig, my partner, wasn't able to go last minute, so he sent me when I was brand spanking new and didn't even really know what medical malpractice meant, and sent me with Williams on Obstetrics textbook, which for those who don't know is about, 7 inches thick.
7,000 pages long.
And told me to just give it a quick glance on the drive up to Edmonton and figure out what's going on. So that was the beginning of me realizing how difficult of an area of law this is. But, I certainly don't consider myself anywhere near an expert, and I think I could be practicing this for 30 years and still know very little compared to everything there is to know. But, I think it's something that you chip away at and you're passionate about, and if you put in the work and you don't get overconfident, you know when to seek help and who to seek help from, you can do a lot for your clients.
I think that's the magic in many careers, that you have eternal learning to do. Yep. There's always more questions. It's been surprising to me in healthcare even. You just think you've got it figured out, and you don't. You got nothing figured out.
That's fair.
There's so much to learn. Well, we're here today to talk about your story as a young medical malpractice lawyer in a hospitalization in the birth of a baby, which I understand from talking to you that had some worries and complications, both before and during and after the birth. So just tell us your story, Maia.
Oh, where to begin? I actually had a pretty easy pregnancy, other than vomiting every day for the entire pregnancy. It really wasn't anything out of the ordinary or had any issues, but I will say from the get-go, I got referred to one of the maternity clinics in town and awkwardly had to ask to be switched to another clinic because we were suing two of their doctors. And
oh my!
I
so
can tell
there's
you,
a reality most people just don't have to deal with.
Yeah,
right?
it's an uncomfortable situation, and I have to say, I don't really know any other female plaintiff medical malpractice lawyers in Calgary, and I talked to some in Edmonton, but it seems that the system for referrals and all of that in Edmonton is a bit different. And so I ended up contacting a few lawyers I know who work on the defense side in Calgary to ask their advice if there was some way to navigate this. Oh. And none of them had gone through it because they had either not practiced in the area until after they were pregnant, or just didn't have obviously the same perspective as me because they defended them as opposed to me suing them. So that probably put a big red stamp on my health file from the beginning.
Exactly. That sounds like a real challenge.
Yeah.
I didn't know that before we started talking today, and I can only imagine that must have been one of the most awkward situations you might ever face.
Yeah, it was uncomfortable, and it's hard because I don't obviously want to appear as if I'm threatening anyone in the medical profession, but I also didn't want to end up in the hospital with a doctor who I assume would probably be uncomfortable having me as their patient and me potentially being uncomfortable having them as my physician. So, ended up getting transferred to another clinic where we had no active lawsuits against any of the physicians, and that was fine. But anyway, so pregnancy was all pretty easy. And then when I was at I believe I would have been about 34 weeks or so, doing the kick counting, and one night laying in bed and realizing that I hadn't felt as many kicks as I normally did, so started counting, and in the 2 hours I got, I believe, 2 movements that I felt. So woke up my husband and went to the hospital to check on things.
And just for people listening, ideally you get 5 or 6 kicks or up to 8 in 20 minutes, right? You want that to happen. So two in 2 hours is definitely decreased fetal movement.
Exactly. And what I was always told is that if you don't get 6 in 2 hours, then to go to the hospital. And I was very used to getting, 10 in 3 minutes.
Right.
So
exactly.
It was a stark difference from the usual for me, at least. So we went to the hospital, and they were tracking the fetal heart rate. And the fetal heart rate was fine, but I still wasn't getting those movements. And I think that was kind of the first situation I had where I felt a bit like I had to advocate for myself in some way, because the nurse that I had at the hospital that night, gave me the little kick counter clicker thing.
Right, attached to the monitor.
Yeah, exactly. Telling me to click every time I felt a movement, and I still wasn't feeling movements when I was there. And told her that after I'd been there for a few hours, and she came over and put her hand on my stomach and essentially told me, well, I felt a movement there. Didn't you feel that? Mm-hmm. I said, no. And, you're already a little bit worried. Like, I will say I felt like I was less stressed than I thought I would be in these kinds of situations. But at the same time, you're nervous. You don't feel that confident in anything you're saying. And to be told that I should be feeling movements when I'm not was not helpful.
Right.
Luckily, the physician who was on call that night was great and essentially told me that, if you're not feeling them, then that doesn't count and it's no good. But
so if we could stop there for just 1 sec, how would you have liked that nurse? Because there's doctors and nurses listening into this podcast. That's part of the intended audience. How do you wish that nurse had responded in that moment?
I think that if she had put it more as, I think I can potentially feel a movement there. Are you able to feel that? And then let me answer without essentially instilling what she was saying to me.
Did they know you were a medical malpractice lawyer going in, or is this, not that it matters or should matter in the long run, but did they know?
I don't think they would have in that situation unless, honestly, there was a big flag on my neck here.
The chart that's been flagged. Sure. All sorts of colors,
I kind of doubted at the hospital that night that they would have been aware of that. But I just feel that she could have, said that what the doctor said, essentially, that if you're not feeling it, then that's not okay, because for her to tell me that I should be feeling something and then I'm going to go home and be very unsure as to whether, is that a movement? Is that a movement?
So it sounds like you felt unheard.
Yeah. And I just wouldn't have felt comfortable leaving the hospital and being able to, on a go-forward basis, know whether I was having movements or not.
Right.
Because I was essentially told that I wasn't feeling whatever I should be feeling.
Oh, I see. So your trust in your own body and your own assessment, the situation was questioned, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Got it.
But since his heart rate was okay, they monitored it for quite a while. They sent me home, brought me back in the morning to have an ultrasound, which was reviewed by, I believe, a perinatologist. And I was told at that point that it looked like he had a double nuchal cord. So umbilical cord wrapped, I don't have to tell you, obviously, but for
tell the
benefit
audience,
of you.
Tell everybody. Yeah, tell everybody.
So an umbilical cord wrapped around his neck twice is what it appeared to be on the ultrasound. And again, there was something interesting in that moment, because that physician said, we normally don't even tell patients when we see this, or we don't usually even see it because, it's only because we did this ultrasound. But in your case, because you had the reduced fetal movement, we are letting you know that this is
The
what we
cord is
think.
around the neck.
And I thought that was interesting because, I struggle with it because I understand that there's different types of people. And there's a lot of people that being told that would just stress them out and make everything worse. And perhaps there's no reason to put that undue stress on them. But I'm the type of person where I'd rather know what's going on. And I found that frustrating throughout the process because I felt like everyone was trying to just make you feel better and
I see.
appease you to some degree. And I almost wish that when you went into the hospital, there was a personality test that was done that found out what kind of patient you are.
Right.
If you're somebody that would rather know all the facts, then they could do that. And if you're not, then that's fine.
Who just wants to pretend everything's fine.
Yeah, because that was kind of a recurring theme. And while I get it.
And what was your reaction in that minute when you heard the news, the cords around the neck, and you have the decreased fetal movement? And I'm assuming you either had an understanding or it was explained to you what the relationship between those two things were.
Yeah.
The cord around the neck and the movement. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, obviously from the work I do, I expected, or at least I thought I understood, that the cord around the neck could result in obviously oxygen deprivation or not enough transfer between the placenta and the baby. So a lot of issues that lead to things that unfortunately a lot of the clients we represent end up suffering from.
Got it.
But yeah, I don't know. My reaction, I thought I would be a lot more stressed than I was about things. And I guess because he had a reassuring heart rate throughout. And then from that point on, when I went home, they had a nurse come every day to my house and check his heart rate. So I was able to be reassured on a daily basis that things were still okay. And I didn't have any more reduced fetal movement from that point. So I felt reasonably confident that things were okay.
Like on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident?
I'd say an 8, which surprises me even. That's saying
good.
It. Yeah, I don't know what it is. Talking about it now, it seems like something that I would have been much more anxious about, but I wasn't that bad.
Well, I'll tell you, Coming in Gillespie, the firm you work for, sponsored a golf tournament, and I happened to, actually held a golf tournament, and I sponsored the lunch at that golf tournament that day, which happened to be the day that you were going into hospital for induction of labor.
Yeah.
And so I was very curious about your news, and I asked everybody, how's she doing? And everybody's perception was, she's doing fine. And I was like, wait a second, isn't she in a full-blown panic? They said, no, she's so calm. So I think your 8 out of 10 translated to everybody else. You must have been either in shock and denial, or really in a true sense of calm at that time, because that's what everybody thought about you in that scenario.
Yeah, and I'd say the day I went in to get induced, things were pretty calm, and I knew what was expected to happen at that point, at least.
Right.
So yeah, I was fine. But yeah, so I got induced at 39 weeks because of the double nuchal cord. It was essentially just said that there was no benefit in keeping him in there any longer and the risks associated with that. So we decided to go ahead with an induction, which I guess you always look back and wonder what would have happened if you didn't do that. But at the same time, by 39 weeks, and I'm the type of person where once I get something in my head, it gets stuck there. So when I was told that I would be induced at 39 weeks, I don't think I would have been as calm and chill if it had continued past the 39 weeks.
Got it.
So that's probably part of the reason that I was very okay with going in at that point.
So when you just said, when you look back, you wonder how things might have gone different, what prompted you to say that?
Well, essentially what happened with my labor is that I was induced on the Thursday evening, and then the balloon came out on the Friday morning, and things were as they should be. I was 3 centimeters dilated from that, and they began the oxytocin induction. And
just a quick clarification on the balloon.
Yeah.
Because
I'm not using the proper terminology.
Well, no, it's exactly proper, but just saying the balloon came out on Thursday, I mean, that could conjure up all kinds of pictures, but
this is true.
It's a method of dilating and stretching the cervix before induction, where it actually is a balloon that's filled with water, like 30 cc's of water, right into the cervix to give it I'm pretty sure it doesn't feel that good. I've never had it done, but
not as bad as you'd expect.
But
at the same time, when your expectations of things are that they'll be terrible, then everything's better.
So that's the balloon. Anyway, it's just a part of the process of induction to get your body prepped so that the oxytocin works. So anyway, carry on. Sorry for the interruption.
That's
just didn't want to leave that point dangling.
That's fair. So they started the oxytocin induction. I didn't feel anything for the longest time, to the point where the nurse was saying, you're having what look like reasonably strong contractions on the monitor. You're not feeling anything? And I'm like, no. And the nurse even mentioned, she's like, I don't want to get your hopes up, but there is like the very odd person who doesn't feel the pain or the contractions.
Right.
So for about half an hour there, I thought I might be this superwoman person who would just have this baby without feeling anything.
Right.
But that was not the case, unfortunately.
Darn it.
Yes. So essentially they just kept increasing the oxytocin. Then partway through the day, I started really feeling the contractions, and they got more and more aggressive. I also opted not to get an epidural at that point because largely I think I was concerned that it would slow down the progress of labor, and probably a part of me had some pride and wanted to see if I could do it without. And it just kind of kept going and kept getting stronger, and they kept jacking up the oxytocin, and they'd check me and nothing was happening. I remained at 3 centimeters. They ruptured my membranes. I remained at 3 centimeters at one point. And then his heart rate started dropping with every contraction. So that is where I lost any chill factor I had.
Right.
Just because it was quite stressful. Obviously, with the cases we deal with, I look at a lot of fetal heart tracings, and it was starting to look a lot like one of our cases. And so
your understanding was that was associated with a poor outcome. That was what you were seeing.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And so at that point, the doctor did call in an obstetrician to consult, and that initial meeting did not go very well. Essentially, the OB said that, yes, the heart rate's dropping, but it's recovering, and so I'm okay with it right now and okay with you continuing, which is fine. And I didn't expect or want, an emergency C-section or anything at that point, but my question was, at what point does your risk tolerance for this end? If this continues the way it's been going for now hours, at what point are you no longer okay with it?
Right.
And, probably he was a bit taken aback by the question, or maybe the way I asked the question. And he certainly didn't know what I do. The GP knew what I do. Right. So she kind of acted as a go-between with us and helped with the communication. And, initially his response was, well, you can get a C-section anytime you want. You could have opted to have a C-section a week ago if you wanted. And to that,
and how'd that sit with you?
I was not happy.
Yeah.
That was the one time I actually broke down during the whole thing, just because it was so frustrating to feel like, first of all, I don't want a C-section. I don't think there's that many people who are very excited to have a major surgery. But, it just felt very dismissive, and like he didn't think I knew anything about what was going on, which I'm certainly, like I said, I'm not a medical expert. I could tell a little bit about what was going on with the tracing, but I can't read them perfectly. But yeah, it was definitely frustrating. And I know my husband was frustrated because he was, every time they'd walk away, he'd be like, tell them what you do. Tell them right now.
Yeah,
like,
right.
No, that's not going to help anything. But
well, that's a tough, it's a tough road to navigate when you've got, I mean, I know that from being a nurse in the healthcare system. You're there as a patient or a mother or a daughter, whatever it is the situation, but you're also there with a lot of knowledge, and it's a fine line between being respected for what you know and being shut out and belittled for what you know. And so I can feel in my own self what you must have been feeling in that moment on some level.
Yeah. So that, like, essentially from that point, we agreed that we would keep going and see how things went. But I think it was after 16 hours of feeling the contractions and then by that point, the oxytocin was up at, I can't remember, there was 26 or 28 at one point when I looked at it, but obviously another red flag for me doing what I do. That was quite concerning.
It often isn't above 6 or 8 or 12. It's kind of in that range.
And, you know, my research and knowledge is always that kind of generally the maximum is 20, at least without, you know, further physician's orders, and there were in this case, but still alerting to me to see that number.
So it's fair to say at this point you are not happy about what's going on, regardless if anyone else is happy. Yeah. You're not.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the GP came in. We were talking about, you know, at what point maybe we call it quits on this and go to a C-section. And her suggestion at that point was that, you know, I was a bit of a mess by that point and still hadn't had anything for pain. So she recommended getting an epidural so that no matter what, I could at least kind of have a clear head with whatever decision had to be made. And then she'd check me again and see where I was at that point. So we did that. And I think that was a good decision in terms of being able to relax a little bit.
Of course. Yeah.
And when she
and
checked
you're
me,
still tough.
It's true. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I have always, throughout the whole thing and throughout my pregnancy, I was never one of those people who thought it was weak to get an epidural. It's just in the moment, I think I knew things were not going very quickly and decided that if I just didn't get any, then it would work out and
hurry up.
That baby would start doing something.
Got it.
But yeah, where was I? Sorry.
You just got the epidural and you're glad you did because it relaxed you and it gave you a bit of a clear mind.
But then she checked me again and I was still 3 centimeters.
Oh, man.
But the good thing, I guess, at that point was that the doctor said, you know what, at this point, I'm calling it. It's not your decision, really.
Right.
Which, not to take anything away from me, just in terms of, you know, this is my recommendation as opposed to giving me an option, which I appreciated because I feel like it would be a very hard decision to make.
Sure.
You know, I don't want to jump the gun and have an unnecessary surgery, like I said, but at the same time, I wouldn't deal with it well if I decided to let things keep going and had a bad outcome.
Right. Right. That's a tough decision. I think a lot of people feel that way sometimes in that moment. They're willing to defer the decision. Yeah. And it does give you a sense of peace afterwards, that you don't have to live with either the celebration or the guilt of how things turned out. All right. So we're headed for the OR, the operating room.
So from
still
here,
3 centimeters.
So from here, things were relatively easy for me. My husband, not so much. But going to the OR, they get me all prepped. I've never had any kind of surgery before, so this was all very new to me. But I'm looking around, seeing all the things that I read about in the hospital files. And, you know, obviously getting that perspective was interesting and I think good for me in terms of my future practice. But then, you know, they bring my husband in. 2 seconds later, the baby's out. They show him. He's very small. I had been told all along in my pregnancy that he was likely to be 9 pounds by the time he was born. And he was just over 6 pounds. So that was a bit of a surprise. And I don't know if that was a result of potentially maybe the nuchal cord issue. But in any event, he was
healthy?
Fine.
Oh, yeah. He's fine. Good.
Yeah. So there weren't any issues with him, which was great. After they put him on my chest and I started shaking quite aggressively and then felt nauseous and was worried I was going to vomit on him. So I asked them to take him off and they did. And then I had no idea that this was a possibility. And, I don't know if it's something that people should be warned about, but from what happened to me, I think they should be. Essentially, I guess the epidural just got too high because, they have to put in so much to make sure that you're fully frozen.
Right.
And I started feeling like I wasn't breathing.
Right.
So I guess I started panicking a bit and being like, I can't breathe, and gasping for air. And the nurses were, I'm told, putting my hand on my chest and trying to prove to me that I was in fact breathing. But I was still shaking and all of this was going on. So an anesthetist gave me something to calm me down, and it knocked me out. And so from this point, I don't know anything that's going on, but from what my husband has told me, he turns around and all of a sudden I'm out, but he's reassured that, that's fine. Don't worry. She's just going to take a little nap and all is good. You go hang out with your baby. So he does that. Then he looks back and I'm being bagged. So apparently I did stop breathing.
Oh, I see. So bag and mask ventilation
is
what we're talking about here, right?
Yeah. And so I woke up thinking I must have just nodded off because I was exhausted.
Right. And
was told that, no, I've been out for about 45 minutes. And yeah.
Right.
My husband's eyes were the size of
right.
saucers.
Well, yeah, if he's standing by watching that, not expecting any
not
of it,
knowing what's going on. Yeah.
Very surprising.
Yeah. So, but that was that. And, at the end of the day, as somewhat crazy as this story is, everyone was fine. I was fine. He was fine. I actually had a really good recovery from the C-section. And yeah, there was nothing bad that happened, just some uncertainty in terms of I still don't know what I was given that caused me to stop breathing.
Oh, I see. Besides the epidural, maybe some other medication, you're wondering.
Because I think they did give me something, but it's not in my record.
Oh, and did you get your records?
My doctor, yeah. So my GP at the maternity clinic got them after, because when I told her what had happened, she was like, what? I didn't know any of this happened.
Right.
Obviously, she's not in the OR and not involved as much in the postpartum in the hospital, but
well, and if there is a common drug that could be used during a surgical procedure that does make you stop breathing, right? You got to know
something
that,
to know,
right? You got to know that about your own self.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when if I do have a second child, there's a good chance I would have another C-section. So,
right.
But yeah, she ordered all my records and said there's nothing in there about what I was given, nothing in there about the fact that I stopped breathing. I found out from the records after that I also hemorrhaged. There was quite a bit that I, didn't know obviously in the moment, and fair enough, but there wasn't really a debrief after.
Oh, I see.
Like even by the time I left the hospital, nobody really told me anything more about what had happened. And
is that something you would have appreciated?
Yes.
Yes.
And, I kick myself a bit because I wish I had asked, but I think, after being in the hospital for 2 days and then having a baby and then being there another 2 days and you're exhausted and you're excited to get home and shower in your own shower.
Your priorities shift on their head.
I didn't want to ask anything. I just wanted them to tell me I could go home. So I didn't ask anyone anything. And now it's frustrating just because I feel like I'll never get that information.
Right. Or could you? Could you go back to those doctors and ask those questions?
I have a hard time believing that they'd recall. Obviously, I was one of many C-sections or many deliveries. And so it's hard to say. I suppose I could try, but yeah.
Well,
it's still something that I think about.
Yeah, and don't beat yourself up. I mean, when you're a brand new mother and you had a baby the hardest way there is to have a baby, you go through 16 hours of labor and then have a C-section and some complications and a hemorrhage afterwards. I mean, you were probably on some kind of euphoric high for a couple of days, but your body has gone through 3 major things that it may never go through at the same time again. So, you have to be really kind to yourself for how sharp you were or weren't thinking or what you were up to accomplishing in those first couple of days after the birth.
Yeah. Well, and when you ask if I wish I had been told, I think the thing is, with the hemorrhaging, for example, from what I understand, that can cause issues with breastfeeding and all these other things that I wasn't aware of. I had some of those issues, and perhaps, that would have made me feel less like I was screwing up or it was my fault, because, you know, it's so crazy, because I have so many friends that have had issues with, you know, whatever it was, their deliveries or breastfeeding, and I've always been like, you know, don't worry, whatever you need to do, who cares? If the baby is on formula, that's fine. And, you know, I never had strong feelings about any of that, but still, when it was me, I still had trouble not feeling guilty.
Right.
Like, first I felt like my body had failed me by not being able to have a baby the natural way, and then feeling
and how
like
are you doing with that now? Do you feel like you're moving beyond that, or is that still a struggle?
I feel fine with it. Like, I think I'm generally a pretty logical person, so when I start thinking about it logically, I recognize that that's silly, and, you know, it doesn't frankly matter which way you have the baby and all of that, but it still sometimes hits me a little bit. And I think, you know, you just see or hear stories about other people, there's a little bit of jealousy there, I guess.
Oh, really?
You know what I mean? I don't know.
Well, if I could just share with you from my experience, you know, I was relieved to hear that you had a C-section. I was, just knowing what I know about nuchal cords in babies, and if that baby wasn't descending and you're still at 3 centimeters after 16 hours of painful contractions, like the safest way out for that wee one was a C-section. So when I heard, I was like, yay.
Yeah, see, and I appreciate that, because the other thing is, like, in terms of what we were talking about before with everyone just trying to reassure you, like the number of times I was told when I was in the hospital that I wish nobody had ever told you about the nuchal cord. You know, we deliver all the time with umbilical cords around babies' necks and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I recognize that that's true. And a lot of times it doesn't cause issues and they're able to get it off quickly without problems. But, you know, in cases like mine, obviously, it does cause issues. And I'd rather know that there's a reason for that.
Sure.
So, and yeah, it turned out it was, because they did another ultrasound and they were like, we can't tell. Maybe it's not even, it might only be around there once, and it's hard to tell. Right. And it turned out it was around his neck twice and around his shoulders once. So I think it would have probably not gone well if we had continued.
Well, I guess fair enough to qualify that so that people don't get unnecessarily worried, because you're absolutely right. The cord is around the neck. I don't know what the stats are, maybe 30 to 40% of the time, but it's not uncommon. Yeah. And it often doesn't cause any problems. But you just happen to have this whole triad of things going on, the failure to descend, the failure to progress, the decreased movement, and in the end, the small size, which you wouldn't want to progress in any negative way. So I think it's good you had a C-section.
I think it is as well.
Let's just lay that thing to any guilt you have about anything else. Let's just lay that to rest.
I appreciate it.
Right here. Well, so let's move on to talking about how this experience has changed you. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about things you wish you'd known and things you wish other people knew, including doctors and nurses, based on your experience, because I think there's something really valuable for us all to learn here, for doctors, nurses, other lawyers, other mothers having babies, the general public. There's something here, and that's why I was so excited that you wanted to tell your story or share your story with us. So if we could go back a little bit, I guess, going into the hospital, knowing what you know about the potential for bad outcomes. And I know we've had this conversation before. I was worried about you as a young pregnant mama because I was like, her perception must be that things turn out badly all the time.
Well, I actually remember the first time I ever met you.
Yes.
When we had lunch with you, myself, and Craig Gillespie, and you and Craig were talking about a few of the files you were working on together, birth injury cases. And I just sat there, I think, with my mouth hanging and my eyes wide. And you turned to me at one point and went, "But I swear that only happens like 0.01% of the time." So I've always remembered that and tried to remind myself of that, because you're right. We only see the terrible situations and the terrible outcomes, and it is sometimes easy to convince yourself that this is commonplace, because nobody calls us when things go well, but I have always reminded myself of that, thanks to you.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that, because my experience is that things almost always turn out really well. Everybody goes home alive and well, which is really good. But talk to me about how your experience as a medical malpractice lawyer shaped your perceptions, your fears, your hopes as you were entering into the healthcare system?
I would say that I was unsure how I would react with, they say having a little bit of knowledge is a bad thing or a dangerous thing. And I kind of wondered if that would be the case, that I would see something on the strip and not fully understand it or comprehend it and get myself all worked up. But I would say that's not the case. And I actually think, for at least the type of person I am, having the knowledge I did going in was a very beneficial thing. Because I think, understanding the procedures, understanding how it all goes, understanding from the very beginning that there was at least some chance that I would have a C-section, so that didn't come as a surprise. It wasn't really, even though I had those moments where I didn't like the idea of it, I think I was generally okay with it. So that all was a benefit to me going into the healthcare system. I think from some cases we've had, I've also recognized that it is important to advocate for yourself. I was surprised sometimes at my inability to do that when it was me in the situation. I think it's a lot easier to advocate for somebody else.
That is so true.
So yeah,
right?
Like even I've been there with a friend of mine who, when she was delivering her baby, and it was much easier for me in her situation to say, how are you interpreting the strip, and are you comfortable with the way things are going, to the nurse and things like that. Whereas when it was me, I had trouble figuring out how to navigate that. And sometimes, you just have too many thoughts going through your head and you can't clearly and concisely voice what you want or what you're thinking.
And you're in pain and you're exhausted and you're scared and you're everything.
Yeah. So
no guilt around that either.
No,
okay. That wasn't your job in that situation, to interpret the monitor tracing. It wasn't your job.
They probably got annoyed with me pulling the tracing out of the drawer and trying to read it.
Maya. I've had people like you for patients. I know what we're talking about here.
No. But yeah, so I think for other people, feeling comfortable standing up for yourself is important.
Yeah. I just want to say, it sounds to me like what you're saying is, in some ways, this difficult work that you do prepared you for this experience.
I think so.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like I said, I've never had surgery. I've never been in a hospital for myself before this. So had I not read so many hospital files and understood a lot of the terminology, especially with respect to labor and delivery, I think I would have been very confused about what was going on. And I also, for myself, often don't ask questions when I should, even though if I was dealing with somebody else, I would ask all those questions.
Right.
So I think for me, it was nice knowing what was going on. Had I not had that background, I'd be probably sitting there working myself into a frenzy.
Right. Or ignorantly blissful about the whole, blissfully ignorant about the whole situation.
That's true. But you never know. Yeah,
you never know. So what would you say is the most important thing you learned from this experience?
I think just to be open to whatever has to happen. Like, I know a lot of people who are very adamant about their birth plan.
Right.
I'm glad that I never came up with a birth plan because it certainly would not have gone to plan.
Right.
So that's one thing. Certainly to advocate for yourself, or have somebody, even better, have somebody there who can do that for you. I think for most people, that's probably the better option. And I suppose not to be shy about asking questions and questioning what's going on. And, not that you have to be aggressive about it or question anybody's decision making, but just so that you understand where your provider's head's at.
Right. No, that's really good advice, and not easy for a lot of people to do, to question.
It was hard for me, and I usually have no trouble being a loudmouth.
You're not scared of much. But I think questioning a doctor when you're a patient in the bed, I mean, there's a real hierarchy there, and sometimes a respect and fear even of the profession and of what's going on at the time. So those are really good tips. I mean, really good advice. did this experience change your view of doctors and nurses and healthcare?
Not really. Like, sometimes I wonder if it's more common than I think it is, just because it seems somewhat ironic that my situation didn't go very well. But at the same time, I had really good nurses. I had good doctors. I might not have liked everything that was said or the way things were handled, but generally, all the providers I dealt with were very good at their jobs and were good about reassuring us or dealing with our concerns. And frankly, that's the perspective I had before. We do see the worst of the worst, and there have been some cases where there seems to be no remorse or concern about an outcome
by the healthcare professionals.
Yeah. Like, obviously when we're in the litigation and things like that, but I'd say for the most part, it's a very difficult job. It's very fast paced, and unfortunately bad decisions can have very negative consequences, for most of us. Like, for my job, if I screw up, it can, not that it can't have a very negative outcome for somebody, but it's financial. And, as
versus
we know,
life and death.
Exactly. No amount of money can take back a very bad outcome. So, I think that's the difficult thing. So, it's easy for us when we're in litigation to come down hard on a physician or a nurse who is negligent in the moment. You can also understand that things do go wrong, and it's not because they're a bad person, right, or that they wanted that to happen. It just is a difficult job, and you have to be extremely cautious, I guess, to avoid those things.
I think all the nurses and doctors listening will greatly appreciate what you just said, just the recognition that it's a tough job, and things happen.
Yeah.
And things happen. I mean, sometimes it's negligence, and sometimes it's 1,000 other things,
right.
But that's a topic of another day that we can talk about. But for the nurses out there listening, was there a shining moment for the nursing care that you would say, oh man, this nurse said or did this, and it was...
The nurse I had for most of the night and then going into the C-section, she was amazing. And I think she mentioned that I think she spends most of her time in the OR, because she had said that it was kind of nice getting to be in the labor and delivery room with me, because she doesn't get to do that as often. And I think she is quite senior. And she was just generally very calm, but I could tell from things she said and things she did that she was a nurse who, if she disagreed with the physician, would say something. And for me, that was very reassuring, because, there are cases where, unfortunately, that happens, where the nurses have concerns, but maybe they don't vocalize it or don't put it up the ladder beyond the doctor initially. And so that's something that I guess I was probably a bit concerned about going in, just because you spend so much time with the nurse.
So it sounds like you were relieved that you perhaps had an advocate on your side beside yourself.
Yeah.
Good.
And she also reassured me that the obstetrician who did my C-section if she had to choose one to do hers, if she was in that situation, that he was the guy, and whether she was just saying that to reassure me or not, it worked. So that was also...
Let's go with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Nurses typically mean that, and they know. Nurses know the good doctors.
Yeah, that was reassuring.
So what about for the doctors out there listening? Was there a shining moment in your medical care?
I appreciated when the GP kind of stuck up for me in that initial interaction with the obstetrician, and essentially forced him to give me a better answer than he had initially given me to my question about his risk tolerance and where it would end. And I don't know if that was partially because she knew what my profession is and could tell that I was not pleased with his initial response, but that also did a lot, because I think if he had just left after saying that, I would not have been as calm from that point forward, most likely.
Got it. All right. That's good to know. Is there anything else? I mean, you've talked a little bit about, Like, it seems like the difficulties that you experienced were in part because you didn't feel heard, or not enough weight was given to your concerns. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, and I think I also, by the time things were really happening, I didn't have a lot of trust that I would be told what was really happening, just because of the prior situations where I wish nobody had told you this. We don't usually tell patients this. And that kind of stuff. I probably doubted that they would tell me it like it is. So
interesting. So based on those two things, not being heard and not necessarily trusting that you'll get all the information, and you're being the type of person that wants all the information.
Yes.
What advice do you have for doctors and nurses in that situation? Besides the personality test, which may or may not be practical. So let's just pretend there is no personality test. Yeah.
A practical solution. I don't know how this would come about, but I feel like the treatment providers who pay attention to you and your reactions to things, I think people can get a pretty good sense of what type of person someone is very quickly if they pay attention. So maybe doing that.
Paying attention.
You don't necessarily need a personality test to tell if somebody is getting really anxious, if they want more information, if they kind of just need to tune out everything and be told exactly what to do in that moment. It's tough, and I don't know if there's training for that or something that could happen, but I just feel like that makes the biggest difference. And I know, for myself, like, we have those issues too, dealing with clients.
Of course.
There's some clients that, you really have to hold their hand through the process, and you're part lawyer, part counselor, and that's fine. That's what some people need. Some people they don't care if you're borderline rude to them because they just want the information and they need to be told it very bluntly. And and we obviously have more time generally to learn what our clients are like. But it's one of those things that in my practice, I know it makes a huge difference. I can't treat every client the same way, and I don't think every patient should be treated the same way.
Right.
And I do feel like might be moving into the women topic a bit here, but we have a patriarchal society, and obviously in labor and delivery, it's all about women, and I feel like their voices often are not heard or not given enough credit.
Right. Well, that's a topic we're going to come back and talk about, because I know you have lots to say on that, and I want to hear everything that it is. Let's go 2 more questions on this particular topic, because I'd like to know, first of all, how or has this experience changed the way that you'll approach medical malpractice cases in the future?
That's a good question. It's hard to say, because I was certainly empathetic before, but I think and when I say empathetic, I mean empathetic towards, the mother or the parents or family members in our cases. But I certainly have a much better appreciation now. It's one thing to read a ton of hospital files and talk to people about their experience, and it's another thing to go through it and experience it firsthand. So, taking my experience and recognition of the difficulties you can have when it's you in that moment, and applying that to, I guess, my review of our cases. That's certainly one thing. Questioning the records to some degree, because there's obviously some things that are missing from my record that I feel very strongly should be in there. So that's a concern, but yeah.
Well, those are good and interesting things that I think are very, very particular to your situation, and you as a lawyer, a medical malpractice lawyer. I know, I worked in labor and delivery for a long time, and every once in a while we'd have a medical malpractice lawyer having a baby, and not like they got any different care or expertise in any way, but it certainly heightened your awareness of what you said and what you did and what you wrote. So I'm not surprised, I guess, that you're finding that there may be things missing from your record, or you felt like you couldn't trust things. People are trying to reassure you versus giving you the straight skinny on what was going on. But, I can just see as a lawyer, and anybody listening, you've got a lawyer on your hands. You probably have some version of Maia on your hands. And I would say that personality-wise, this would be pretty true. Rather than being secretive, most lawyers that I know are going to be much better off with the straight talk. They can handle the straight talk and handle the hard conversation and be grateful to have the information on board. So there's like a little lesson for everybody listening. So just one last question on this particular topic. You've already mentioned if you decide to have a second baby and you'll likely have a C-section, going into that experience with all of this knowledge now, your medical malpractice experience, seeing the bad outcomes, and now seeing the somewhat complicated, but at the end of the day, good outcome that you've gone through. How are you going to approach it differently, or what are you glad you know now going in a second time around?
For my husband's sake, I will not try and be a hero with pain medication and that kind of thing.
Oh, right. That was hard on him.
It was hard on him, apparently.
Oh,
but
poor guy.
No, his perspective after when he found out that most often, obviously, you can have vaginal birth after C-section, but most often C-section is indicated, and he was quite excited to hear that can be a scheduled thing and not have to go through all the stress of it.
Right.
So there's that.
It's still all about men, isn't it? Really.
He was very hungry and very tired, Chris. You can understand.
I can understand. I've met Maia's husband, and we've had a little talk about his experience of this, and he calls it the worst 7 minutes of his life is the whole experience in the operating room. And I'm like, this just isn't about you.
Exactly. But I think I would ask more questions. I would put away the part of me that feels some sense of embarrassment or nervousness or guilt about asking questions, and just do it. Because, there were lots of times, even just when I went to the doctor at the maternity clinic, and nothing significant, but I'd kind of have a question, and then I'd be like, it's not that big a deal, I don't need to ask it. And then you just always have that lingering in your head. And again, not that it was anything significant at that point, but that certainly carried on kind of throughout my medical care, and it just made me feel foolish because I'm not the type of person who holds back generally. And so I don't know why I had that in this situation, but that's something I would try and move past next time around.
Yeah, good. Well, I hope you do. Thanks. I think it's an interesting thing. The personality of people in the law profession and in the healthcare profession are quite widely apart. But there's two things that we share, both of us, and that is wanting to be the most well-informed, well-prepared person in the room. So you've got that, and your doctor would have that. So it kind of makes sense to me that when your two worlds collide, that would be a thing for you. Yeah. It's not uncommon, but I think that's really good advice. And from my perspective, I just like to feel useful. I don't care about the question. If people ask whatever the question is, as a healthcare professional, you're grateful to share your knowledge with them. So if anybody else out there has struggled or thinks they might struggle with the same issue, just don't. Yeah. Just get over that.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Just ask what you want to find out what you need to know and find out what you want to know. I think that's really good. Well, why don't we end this conversation here? I could talk to you for hours about this, Maia. I think we could talk about a lot of things. Yeah. But I want to thank you very much. I think there's some very personal and insightful things that you shared with us that will be of great interest to a lot of different people. And I appreciate your candid conversation about the struggles.
I appreciate you inviting me, and it's been somewhat therapeutic for me as well. So
that's I'm glad to hear that.
Anything that I was holding on to, I feel confident I'll move on from now.
Therapy session right here.
Exactly.
And your baby is gorgeous. I'm telling you, her baby is absolutely gorgeous. He's just a beautiful, beautiful little man.
He's huge now too. He's packed on the pounds that he was missing.
Oh, good for him. So just before we close today, I just want to say, if you're a patient out there and wondering if you have a medical malpractice case, and you'd like to talk to Maia about that potential, you can find her at Cumming and Gillespie Law Firm here in Calgary, Alberta. She's currently off on mat leave, but going back to work very shortly. We're filming this in February 2020, and she'll be back at work next month, probably by the time you're listening to this. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much, and I'd love to have you back to talk about women in law.
Thank you, Chris.